Hi, this is the lecture on PTSD. It's the first lecture in the Trauma and Relational Disorders unit. So in this lecture, this class, we're going to talk about the definitions of stress and trauma, the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and really focus on the etiology. So risk factors, precipitating factors, precipitating factors, and perpetuating factors. And then at the end, we'll touch a little bit on treatment, mostly just as a way to summarize and contextualize the videos that you guys are watching alongside this lecture. A big topic also is going to be memory reconsolidation, and false memories is the topic of the consolidation activity for the next class, which focuses on developmental trauma disorders. Okay, so the psychological definition of stress is pretty basic. It's any feeling of emotional strain or pressure. Stress is often caused by factors in the environment. So an organism feeling like it can't control what happens to it or can't predict what happens in its environment, not having an outlet to express frustration or other emotions, and experiencing social subordination. So being bullied or dominated or lacking authority in your social setting. These are stressors that are shared by humans and non-human species. Obviously, as humans, we all kind of know what are some of the human-specific causes of stress in our modern environment. Stress can also be driven by internal experiences. So having psychopathology is stressful. Anxiety and depression are often precipitated by stress, but the experience of these negative emotions also causes subsequent stress. And as we talked about in the depression lecture, this is one of the perpetuating factors of depression. Chronic low-grade stress leads to HPA axis hyperarousal, which leads to HPA axis desensitization, which leads to greater difficulty in the future controlling the physiological response to stress, also leading to subtle neurodegeneration and damage to the hippocampus. However, stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. For one thing, stress can be caused by positive life events. Getting married, getting a new job, having a baby, all of these things cause emotional strain and pressure, but they're not considered negative life events. The technical term for stress caused by happy things or positive life events is eustress. In addition, some level of emotional strain and pressure is necessary for optimal functioning. So really low levels of stress can feel like being calm. At really, really low levels of stress, it can even be experienced as feeling bored and understimulated. Our performance at physical tasks, challenging tasks, and intellectual tasks actually improves as our level of stress increases towards a peak of optimal stress. Past that peak, we start to experience the negative consequences of stress, like fatigue, tiredness, negative effects on health, which we talked about in the depression lecture, and what this figure is calling breakdown and burnout, but what can also be the precipitation of psychopathology. So as we talked about in the anxiety and depression and psychosis lectures so far, experiencing stress is often associated with the precipitation of symptoms of one of these forms of psychopathology. So stress and trauma are distinct terms, although trauma is a subcategory of stress. The DSM-5 just defines trauma as any exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Basically, any experience where your physical integrity or potentially your life is threatened. This can be through direct experience. So one of these things happening to you, seeing it happen to someone else, learning that it happened to someone really close to you, or repeatedly hearing or seeing details of this kind of stress happening to someone who's not close to you, often through occupational, often because of someone's job. So repeated or extreme exposure to, for example, images of child sexual abuse by child social workers investigating abuse or police investigating child sexual images, or constant repeated exposure to other people's traumas as a therapist who treats PTSD. So as this figure shows, trauma is a subset of stress. Everyone experiences stress, and trauma is actually not particularly rare either. Population-based studies in the United States suggest that the prevalence of having one of these experiences in your lifetime is upwards of 70%. That's higher than most other Western countries, but actually lower than some developing countries. So because trauma, by definition, is a threat to survival, it provokes a fight or flight response. Your sympathetic nervous system is designed for this. Your body is prepared to attack an aggressor or run away and hide when you're experiencing a threat to your survival. This is maintained by the sympathetic nervous system. However, we also have a secondary response to threats to our survival. This response is mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system. And within the kind of onomatopoeia of the fight or flight response, we call this the freeze, fragment, and feigning death response. This is basically an organism's last ditch response when fighting or running away are no longer an option. As I said, this is mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system, and specifically by one branch of the parasympathetic nervous system called the dorsovagal complex. We can think of this as basically pulling the emergency brake. It totally shuts down all sympathetic nervous system activity, which is the role of the parasympathetic nervous system. However, usually when the parasympathetic nervous system controls the sympathetic nervous system, the shutdown is slower and more gradual. We experience it as kind of de-escalating arousal. When the dorsal vagal complex is activated, we experience it as just a sudden, abrupt shutdown. And the behavioral response to this is something like freezing in fear, for some animals, falling over and playing dead and being totally unresponsive to their environment. And for humans, dissociating or fragmenting. So your sort of conscious experience of what's happening to you being suspended and not forming memories or not being consciously aware of what's happening to you. And just like the fight or flight response, the freeze response is part of an organism's evolved adaptive survival response. When fighting or running away are no longer an option, the next best thing is to be really still, play dead, and to basically not consciously experience what's about to happen to you. So again, functions include freezing, fainting, fragmenting, and feigning death. So because traumas are, again, by definition, life-threatening, parasympathetic dorsal vagal complex activation in response to a trauma is relatively common, whereas having a fight or flight response is more often experienced in response to a stressor, but not necessarily a life or death stressor. Freezing comes at the end of the fight or flight response, again, when the fight or flight response is no longer sufficient to help the organism survive. So PTSD is one of the few types of psychopathology that actually has a necessary specific precipitant that needs to be present for it to be diagnosed. To have PTSD, you have to have been exposed to trauma. The specific trauma that is thought to have precipitated the development of PTSD is also called the index trauma, which I'll probably be referring to throughout this lecture. The other symptoms of PTSD involve alterations in memory, so experiencing intrusive memories of the trauma, avoiding anything that reminds you of the trauma, having negative alterations in mood, so low mood, feeling detached, or in cognition, having trouble making decisions, losing interest in things, having memory deficits. And then lastly, hyperarousal, so being really on edge, really prone to going into a fight or flight or even freeze response with less provocation than you would have needed before. So the first criterion for PTSD is exposure to trauma. And again, the definition of this is actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This is the precipitating factor or the index trauma in PTSD. These are some of the symptoms of memory alterations in PTSD. I'm going to go into a lot more detail on the mechanisms of these memory alterations, and the exact symptoms of psychopathology are less important in this class, but they're right here. To be diagnosed with PTSD, you need to have at least one of these memory-related experiences. The third criterion for PTSD is avoidance. So this is kind of an example of where the diagnostic criteria for a disorder don't really map onto the mechanisms or the etiology that well. If you think back to the Tamimi reading, this is one of the things that he was criticizing. The way that we describe and diagnose psychological conditions doesn't necessarily correspond to an etiological model of how they develop. So criterion C involves avoidance of stimuli associated with trauma. But this isn't necessarily so much a symptom as like the main cause and maintaining factor of PTSD. So people with PTSD tend to avoid thoughts, feelings, or talking about the trauma. and environmental cues that are associated with the trauma. So just like in anxiety and even in depression, avoidance is a key behavioral perpetuating factor in PTSD. And sorry, here's again another place where diagnostic criteria don't really map onto etiology. Because in PTSD, people also have to experience so-called negative alterations in cognition or mood. These two, having negative beliefs or expectations about yourself, other people, and the world, or having distorted cognitions about the trauma, leading to inappropriate blame. These are cognitive perpetuating factors. These are another mechanism through which PTSD develops and persists over time. We can sort of think of these other symptoms that are lumped under the same category as consequences of having PTSD. Negative emotional state, just like depression, negative emotional state is perpetuated by negative thoughts and cognitions. Similarly, diminished interest or participation in activities. This is either because of avoidance or because of anhedonia, which is associated with negative beliefs. So the key negative alterations in cognitions and mood that explain where the symptoms of PTSD come from are these negative beliefs about self, others, and the world, and cognitive distortions about why the trauma happened. And then lastly, the criterion E for PTSD involves alterations in arousal and reactivity. So all of these symptoms really reflect inappropriate overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system and a lack of regulation by the parasympathetic nervous system. These symptoms are also perpetuated by deficits in memory, or by a lack of memory storage and retrieval, by changes in beliefs about self, others, and the world, and by avoidance, as I'll talk about later in this lecture when I talk about perpetuating factors. But the cause of these symptoms is chronic overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system and basically the body being on alert, being on guard, and expecting danger in every situation. So after a trauma, we can't diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder right away. And in fact, right after a trauma, most people have at least some of these symptoms of PTSD. After something really scary and really horrible happens to you, it's totally normal to experience changes in your behavior, in your cognition, in your arousal, and to experience alterations in the way that you encode memories of that traumatic event. In fact, it would be kind of abnormal not to have some of these symptoms. And so they probably reflect some kind of adaptive normal learning process. Basically, this is an organism, in the case of humans, the conscious mind asking, why did this happen to me? And what can I do to make sure it doesn't happen again? It's important for us to learn from incidents in our lives that threaten our survival so that we can hopefully avoid them in the future. So in the first 3 days after a trauma, you can't diagnose someone with anything, and having these symptoms is normal. When people experience impairment, so distress or dysfunction due to PTSD symptoms following a trauma in about the month after the trauma happened, they can be diagnosed with what's known as acute stress disorder. But again, PTSD is thought of as a long-term reaction to trauma, and so we can't diagnose PTSD until at least a month after the trauma has passed. When people are still having these trauma reactions that long after they've experienced a trauma, that's when it starts to become quote unquote deviant or relatively abnormal and probably maladaptive. Acute stress disorder doesn't always progress to PTSD, and not everyone who has PTSD experienced or met criteria for acute stress disorder first. PTSD usually develops relatively soon after the index trauma, but it doesn't have to. It can develop years later in some cases. Okay, so here's our etiological model of PTSD. Some people are more predisposed to developing PTSD than others, and we'll talk about some pre-trauma risk factors that make someone more likely to experience these other symptoms of PTSD. PTSD is precipitated by experiencing a trauma, and because of the body's natural, normal, sympathetic, and parasympathetic response to the trauma, experiencing deficits in encoding that trauma memory. So poor encoding of the trauma memory is both a precipitating factor because it happens during the trauma, and it's one of the things that kicks off the chain of events that leads to PTSD, but it's also a perpetuating factor. And it has reciprocal interacting relationships with other perpetuating factors, including changes in the belief system and avoidant behavior. So all three of these things are symptom domains of PTSD. They're also perpetuating factors that keep the symptoms going. So they are part of the etiology of the disorder. And over time, not immediately after trauma, but within or after at least 30 days, these behaviors can lead to the symptoms and the diagnosis of PTSD. Okay, so just to really quickly run through some predisposing factors. Again, almost everyone who's exposed to a trauma has this acute response. They have a fight or flight reaction, often also a freeze reaction, where sympathetic nervous system activation is followed by and abruptly shut down by dorsal vagal complex activation. Having some PTSD symptoms after a trauma like this is considered very normal. So PTSD is really more of a long-term response to trauma. Not all traumas cause PTSD, and two people exposed to the same trauma have different likelihoods of developing PTSD. And this is because everyone differs in where their breaking point is. But the important thing to remember about PTSD is that everyone does have a breaking point. So intensity of the stress experienced during the trauma interacts with pre-traumatic predisposing factors. This is an example of stress diathesis. And so we need to take into account both someone's predisposing factors and the intensity of the stress that they experienced in considering the likelihood that they might go on to develop PTSD. Oops, sorry. So some of the pre-existing risk factors for PTSD include having symptoms of anxiety and depression or having predisposing factors to those disorders. So these are things like having a negative attribution style, having a natural tendency towards hyperarousal, like many people with anxiety disorders do, having an overactive fight or flight response, having a sensitized HPA axis, either because of genetic predisposition or because of prior trauma exposure. Having been exposed to a trauma in the past is one of the biggest risk factors for developing PTSD after a subsequent trauma. Also, the tendency to use unhelpful coping strategies to deal with stress. This is a predisposing factor to anxiety and depression, but also to PTSD. So people who have been exposed to trauma before, people who don't have adequate social support in the aftermath of a trauma, and people who have a particularly rigid set of beliefs about the world are all more likely to develop PTSD following a trauma exposure. So these are some of the predisposing factors. So obviously, the main precipitating factor in PTSD is being exposed to an index trauma. Different types of traumas have a different likelihood of causing PTSD. Interpersonal traumas, or what's also known as assaultative violence, is the biggest cause of PTSD. All things else being equal, if you are put in the hospital after a car accident, you're less likely to develop PTSD than if you're put in the hospital after being mugged, assaulted, or raped. So some of the most potent forms of trauma are combat trauma, but specifically combat trauma involving captivity, torture, seeing people die. The next most potent form of trauma, the type of trauma that's most likely to lead to the development of PTSD, is rape, closely followed by military combat. So again, all of these index traumas are forms of assaultative violence, which isn't to say that you can't develop PTSD after a non-interpersonal trauma, like a car accident or like a natural disaster. It just means that all things being equal, and by all things being equal, I mean predisposing factors, interpersonal assaultative violence is more likely to lead to PTSD. So there is this kind of link between the intensity of trauma and the degree of exposure to a trauma and how likely someone is to develop PTSD. So for example, the whole Gulf Coast region was affected by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. However, the city of New Orleans was affected much more than any other region in the Gulf Coast, both by the direct impact of the hurricane and by the levees breaking and the city kind of falling into disarray for weeks afterwards. So people in Mississippi and Alabama, where the hurricane had an impact, but less of an impact than in New Orleans, were less likely to develop PTSD after Hurricane Katrina. And even within New Orleans, people who had more exposure to trauma because of the hurricane had a higher likelihood of developing PTSD. So again, this isn't surprising, but just to say that there is a correlation between how much a trauma affected you or how intense your exposure was and how likely you are to develop PTSD, regardless of your predisposing risk factors. Another natural example where a large group of people were all exposed to the same trauma was 9/11. And again, there's this kind of linear relationship between how close to home 9/11 hit someone and how likely they were to develop PTSD. So someone who lived in New York City on 9/11, people who lived in New York City on 9/11, about 7.5% of them went on to develop PTSD because of 9/11. People who saw the attacks in person from outside were more likely than that. People who were personally impacted in the aftermath of the trauma by losing their jobs were more likely to develop PTSD. Again, people who were injured were even more likely to develop PTSD, and people who lost someone in the attacks were even more likely. So one of the best predictors of who will develop PTSD is really the trauma itself, how intense it was, and the aftermath. So the repercussions of the trauma, how much it affected someone's life, and how much their life was threatened, or how much they felt that their life was threatened. Interpersonal assaultative traumas are usually the most potent type of trauma. So rape and sexual assault, interpersonal violence, and military combat trauma, or POW trauma. As we saw with Hurricane Katrina and with 9/11, when a whole population of people is exposed to the same large-scale trauma, degree of exposure to that trauma, so how much the trauma affected someone's life and livelihood, it is predictive of how likely they are to develop PTSD, as is kind of the longer-term consequences of the trauma. However, if you could kind of equalize trauma exposure, control for how intensely someone experienced the index trauma and how much it affected their life afterwards, when trauma exposure is equivalent, someone's predisposing factors to developing PTSD. So prior trauma exposure, lack of social support, rigid worldviews, and tendency towards anxiety and depression does predict who's most likely to develop PTSD. So PTSD is a really clear example of a diathesis stress relationship. So I haven't touched on this yet, and I didn't list it as a predisposing factor, but women are more likely to develop PTSD than men, even though women are less likely to be exposed to an index trauma. So some people do consider gender to be another predisposing factor for PTSD. However, I want to raise 2 points that kind of go against that. So one, although men are more likely to experience trauma across the board than women in the United States, the types of trauma that men are more likely to experience are A, less likely to be interpersonal traumas. So men are more likely to experience recreational and occupational accidents and car accidents, and are more likely to witness violence and assault. Women are more likely to experience rape and sexual assault. So again, looking at this figure, rape and sexual assault are very potent index traumas that are very likely to lead to PTSD, whereas things like being shot or stabbed, being assaulted, not to say that these aren't serious events, but they are less likely to lead to PTSD. And we'll talk about some reasons why this might be in the cognitive perpetuating factor part of the lecture. So gender is a risk factor for PTSD in part because even though men are more likely to experience a trauma, women are more likely to experience an assaultative, interpersonal, high impact trauma, like rape or sexual assaults. So gender differences in PTSD can be almost completely explained by gender differences in trauma exposure. Women are both more likely to be exposed to high impact index traumas, and women are also more likely to have had a prior history of the same type of traumas that sensitizes them to develop PTSD. Other aspects of the gender difference in PTSD have to do with gender differences in risk factors for anxiety and depression, where gender really does seem to be a clear predisposing factor, both because of potentially differences in biology, but also largely because of differences in socialization. Women tend to have more maladaptive coping styles. They are more likely to avoid or ruminate about problems. And women may be raised with pre-existing beliefs that the world is dangerous and they're not in control. During their upbringing, women may be less encouraged to feel like they have a sense of agency and control over their lives. And those are predisposing factors to anxiety and depression. Okay, so in this part of the lecture, I'm going to focus on the key perpetuating factors to PTSD that occur both kind of during the trauma and in the immediate aftermath and post-traumatically. Okay, so here's our etiological model of PTSD again. And first I'm going to talk about memory encoding, which is both a precipitating factor and a perpetuating factor in that it's something that happens during the index trauma and in the immediate aftermath of the index trauma, but that also helps to maintain and cause symptoms of PTSD to develop. Okay, so one piece of the etiology of PTSD is that PTSD is caused by a failure to properly consolidate and store memories of the traumatic event. So trauma memories are different than other memories. When they are recalled and remembered, the experience of remembering is much more visceral than the experience of remembering most other autobiographical memories. When you remember a trauma, it feels like you're reliving it. You have the same emotions that you experienced during the trauma. You're experiencing a lot of imagery and other nonverbal aspects of memory, whereas most autobiographical memories are retrieved much more verbally. And as we talked about in the GAD lecture, thinking about negative things or traumatic memories in a more verbally mediated way does help to mitigate the emotional impact of retrieving those memories. Memories of trauma in people with PTSD are also retrieved involuntarily. So it's much easier for these memories to be triggered by the environment. And when they are triggered by the environment, they're very vivid and they feel really real, leading to things like flashbacks and re-experiencing of the trauma. When they're recalled, they also tend to be very fragmented and kind of disconnected from the rest of a person's autobiographical memory. They're not really integrated well into someone's life story. They kind of come up randomly with no context, and often people almost experience them as if they happened outside of the stream of events in their lives. The memories themselves, too, are not very linear. So people will kind of experience little flashes and pieces of the event, but they don't necessarily remember the event as a coherent linear narrative progression. So just a quick reminder about how memory works. There's basically 3 stages of long-term memory storage. So as sensory information comes into our nervous system, it's briefly held in sensory memory as that information is redirected to other parts of the cortex. We are able to hold things in our short-term working memory for a relatively short period of time, but in order for those memories to become permanent, they have to be transitioned into long-term memory through a process known as encoding, where our nervous system processes information and essentially converts it into a network of neurons that co-activate. And when those neurons are activated together, we experience the memory. So that's the encoding process. That memory is then stored in our long-term memory, but also kind of in a physical place in the brain. That cluster of neurons that is activated when we have the memory exists in a physical place. When those neurons are activated, we retrieve the memory. So that activation brings the memory from storage, which is mostly in the temporal lobe, into our conscious awareness and causes our attention to be directed to that memory. So the 3 stages of long-term memory are encoding, storage, and retrieval. And all of these stages are altered and messed up when we try to encode a trauma memory, and particularly when someone develops PTSD. So one of the key etiological factors in PTSD is that trauma memories are poorly consolidated. They're not encoded well, and they're not stored properly. So when a memory is encoded during a period of intense arousal, like really strong sympathetic nervous system arousal, or even more so during dorsal vagal complex arousal, when we may be dissociating and not encoding memories at all. This interferes with the way that the memory is encoded and the way that it's stored in long-term memory. So like I said, the normal process of storage is that the memory is stored in a network of neurons that fire together in the temporal lobe. And activation of that network of neurons does not cause activation in the limbic system. One way that trauma memories are different is that they retain their connection to the limbic system. So when the trauma memory is activated, the limbic system is activated, causing us to feel anxiety, fear, negative emotions, and physiological arousal. And then similarly, when the limbic system is activated by anything else, by stress in our lives, by being startled by something, by having a panic attack, by being stressed out, that limbic activation causes the trauma memory to be activated, retrieved, and re-experienced. In addition, the way that trauma memories are encoded is a little different from normal memories because they are not linear and narrative. They're sort of incomplete. So when trauma memories are retrieved because of this limbic system activation and because they aren't integrated into our narrative life story, we basically re-experience them as if they're happening now. Our nervous system isn't very good at differentiating between the present and the past in which a trauma memory occurred because they're not integrated into our life story. They're not stored in a normal way. So our memory basically functions like a network. All memories exist in these little networks known as nodes of neurons. Each memory node retains connections to other memory nodes in the nervous system. So when one memory node is activated, that activation can spread and cause the activation of a different memory node. And this is basically just the process of being reminded of something. So for example, we all have a network of neurons in our brain that is activated by memories of or experiences of the color yellow. And that node is connected to other things that we associate with yellow, that have co-occurred with yellow, that are relevant to yellow. So activation of the yellow memory node in your brain might spread and activate the school bus node in your brain. It might also spread and activate the node in your brain that stores our knowledge of all the colors. It might spread to the node in our brain that stores our knowledge of bananas, which in turn can spread to the parts of the brain that store our knowledge of other fruits. When trauma memories are activated, trauma memories similar to other memories can be activated by the activation of nearby nodes. And because when they're retrieved, they're so arousing and visceral, we basically re-experience them as they're retrieved. So trauma memories can easily be triggered by things that remind us of the trauma, things that are similar to the trauma, or even by things that might seem really distant through this process of spreading activation. So because these memories are so easily activated and because their activation is so unpleasant and upsetting, it's understandable that many people who experience this start to avoid places, activities, and memories related to the trauma that might trigger that unpleasant, distressing activation. So to summarize, because of the intense physiological arousal and sometimes dissociation that happens during a trauma, the memories of that trauma are encoded poorly. They're not encoded with a lot of detail and specificity. They tend to be encoded in imagery and emotions rather than in words. Over time, we experience fear learning because of the physiological activation that happens when we see things that trigger the trauma. We learn to fear and develop anxiety responses to not just the trauma memory itself, but memories, places, people, and events that trigger the trauma memory. And again, when that fresh trauma memory is activated, it causes all of these physiological and emotional reactions that are similar to what happened during the trauma. So basically, you're having a fight, flight, or freeze response every time that trauma memory is activated. And it is likely that you'll develop new negative associations, negative conditioned associations between that anxiety and arousal you're feeling and other things that are present in your environment. So for example, say that your index trauma happened on a school bus in the fall. It was an interpersonal trauma involving an assault by another teenager. Obviously, because this memory is associated with school buses, seeing a school bus is likely to trigger that trauma memory. But because of spreading activation, maybe seeing other kinds of buses also triggers that trauma memory. Maybe seeing other rows of seats, like in movie theaters or planes, triggers that trauma memory. Maybe other things that were present during the trauma, like the time of year, the temperature, can trigger the trauma memory. Maybe seeing teenagers like the one who assaulted you, or even seeing the color yellow over time can trigger the trauma memory. And because these conditioned stimuli in your environment trigger a trauma memory and physiological arousal, you can develop new conditioned fear associations with all of these things. So whereas before you just had a conditioned fear response to school buses, over time, because of all of this retrieval, you can develop conditioned fear associations to all of these other things that are connected in your memory to school buses. And trauma memories are relatively unique in this capacity because they are poorly integrated and poorly stored in our autobiographical memory. It's easier for them to be activated by even relatively distantly related things. So moving away from trauma memory, now we're just going to talk about all memories. So we're kind of used to thinking of our memory as basically a fact, almost as if our memory is like a video that's always being recorded, and we can look back find the timestamp that we want to remember and see exactly what happened and remember it exactly as it was. However, memory does not work that way. And in fact, when the node that stores a memory is activated, it becomes unstable and subject to change. When neurons are actively firing, this means that they're more likely to form new connections. They may prune receptors, or they may express new receptors. So neural activation of a memory node makes that memory node unstable and subject to change and alteration. And this is a normal part of memory. It's known as reconsolidation. So consolidation happens right after a memory is encoded. Reconsolidation happens when an encoded memory is retrieved and activated. And this can actually lead to changes in your long-term memories that happen during retrieval and working memory. So this is a 7-minute video that sort of breaks down this process of memory reconsolidation. I'm just going to play the whole thing.
Memories are useful for our survival. They allow us to remember the location of food sources, avoid dangerous situations, and form relationships. However, memories can be harmful to us as well. They can cause us a lot of emotional stress, and they can even initiate disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, panic disorder, depression, and phobias. If we can interfere with these harmful memories after they are stored, we can treat patients with these disorders much more easily. Fortunately, recent research on memory shows that every time we recall a memory, it becomes labile, or malleable once again. At this malleable state, we can change, update, or erase parts of memories. But how do we know all this? So this film is made to explain exactly that. When a memory is acquired, it is first temporarily stored in our short-term memory. Then, the memory undergoes a protein synthesis, or simply a stabilization process that strengthens the memory and stores it in long-term memory. This process is called consolidation. According to traditional consolidation theory, researchers thought that memories undergo this stabilization operation once, after acquisition, and that's it. You cannot affect a memory after the stabilization process is complete, they thought. However, in recent experiments, neuroscientists found results that conflicted with this theory. In 2000, Nader, Shafi, and Ludu designed an experiment with rats to understand whether we can change memories after they're consolidated. They decided to, first, create an aversive memory in rats and wait for it to be consolidated. Next, remind the rats of this memory the following day, and once the memory is recalled, try to disrupt the memory with a drug. And finally, test the rats to see if they still remember the original aversive memory. So they started their experiments by creating aversive memories in rats. They trained these rats by presenting them with a tone, followed by a shock to their foot, which is a stimulus that they find unpleasant. As a result of this training, rats learned to associate the tone with the food shock and to expect the food shock whenever they heard the tone. This training is a commonly used behavioral paradigm known as aversive conditioning, or fear conditioning. So, to test if they could erase this aversive memory after it had been consolidated, they came into the lab on day 2 and presented the tone once without the food shock to remind them of the aversive memory. In other words, they reactivated the aversive memory. Shortly after the reactivation of the memory, the researchers injected either a protein synthesis blocker, anisomycin, or simply the regular cerebrospinal fluid, ACSF, into the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain. They predicted that if the stabilization process, or the protein synthesis, was done once, that is only after acquisition, the protein synthesis blocker would not affect the aversive memory. But if the stabilization needed to be repeated whenever the memory was reactivated, anisomycin could disrupt this process, impair, or maybe even delete the aversive memory. The next day, they tested their rats to see whether they still remember to expect the food shock when they heard the tone. They quantified their freezing response as a sign of aversion and compared the responses of rats that received vancomycin to their control group rats, meaning rats that had received the regular brain fluid ACSF instead of the drug. When they looked at their results, they saw that rats that had received the drug vancomycin displayed less freezing in response to the tone, suggesting that their memory of the aversive stimulus was impaired. So it seems like memories become susceptible to changes when they are recalled, and if their stabilization is disturbed, they can be impaired. You might be asking, but how about humans? Similar fear conditioning experiments were conducted with humans, and researchers were able to impair aversive memories in human subjects as well. So, human memories can be changed after initial acquisition too. Taken together, these experiments have shown that the old model of memory processing does not give us the whole picture. The new model suggests that when a memory is acquired, it is first stored in short-term memory temporarily. Then, it undergoes the consolidation process to be stored in long-term memory. Afterwards, whenever we recall this memory, we reactivate it and render it malleable. When reactivated, a memory needs to be reconsolidated through a similar protein synthesis process. If we interrupt the memory during this process, we can update it and store it in its new form. And this protein synthesis process in the new model is called reconsolidation. So, where do we go from here? As you can imagine, interruption of reconsolidation could be a very useful strategy for therapy, if it is used in the right way. In fact, recent studies reported promising results in impairing problematic memories in cases of PTSD, phobia, and addiction. For now, we need to conduct more experiments to confirm these promising results, understand the reconsolidation process better, and explore therapeutic implications of these findings.
All right. Okay, so some takeaways from this video. Memory reconsolidation is the process by which the connectivity to other memory nodes and also to the limbic system and the actual autobiographical details of a memory can be altered through retrieval and processing and working memory. And retrieval and processing and working memory happens whenever a memory node is activated. So reconsolidation is happening all the time. This is basically how we learn things, how we change our minds. Whenever our memory node for example, bananas is activated, it's subject to change. So if we learn something new about bananas, or if we have a positive or negative experience while that memory is activated, that changes our beliefs, our memories, and our knowledge of bananas. So this same process happens with trauma memories when they're reactivated. As I'm going to talk about at the end of this lecture, and as the homework assignment will focus on, cognitive behavioral therapy for PTSD uses exposure, so imaginal exposure, and trauma narratives to activate trauma memories and promote reconsolidation. The process of reconsolidating trauma memories from these fragmented, visceral, limbic connected, easily triggered, non-autobiographically integrated nodes into more coherent, more specific, more contextualized memories is the way that CBT works to help people recover from PTSD and help make the trauma memory less ever present and less likely to cause constant hyperarousal and the development of new conditioned fears. It's important to note that the goal of CBT is not to actually remove memories or alter them to make them less traumatic. In fact, the goal of prolonged exposure therapy is actually to add more details, even though they're usually traumatic, and also context to trauma memories to help make them less liable to be activated by distantly related nodes. The goal of cognitive processing therapy is similar, but it's to integrate the trauma memory with other autobiographical memories by helping to reconsolidate it in a way that makes it fit better into our existing belief system, or sometimes by modifying our beliefs as needed to help explain the trauma. Okay, so avoidance, again, is one of the most important behavioral perpetuating factors of psychopathology in general. And here's why avoidance prevents reconsolidation and makes this process where PTSD trauma memories are poorly encoded last longer and develop into PTSD. So trauma memory activation is really upsetting. It activates the limbic system. It causes a lot of fear and arousal. It makes you feel like you're reliving the trauma. Naturally, some people try to avoid anything that will reactivate that memory. When they're relatively successful, this actually leads to the memories being retrieved and reactivated less often, and also only being retrieved and reactivated involuntarily, non-consensually, in a way that the person didn't plan and prepare for. So this leads to fewer opportunities to reconsolidate because the memory is being retrieved less often, and also for memory reconsolidation to only pile on the trauma and distress. Because when that memory is retrieved, it happens under negative circumstances and the person experiences a lot of distress during that retrieval. What healthy reconsolidation does is it helps to reduce limbic connectivity, because every time we intentionally bring up or think about or talk about or process a trauma memory, we're doing it in a context, in a way when our limbic activity is more under control. That processing and talking about it helps to integrate the memory with other autobiographical memories. It gives it more context and it helps fit it into our narrative of our life in a way that makes it part of our history, but not part of our present. And this whole process helps to separate the memory from limbic arousal and move it to more normal verbal autobiographical memory storage. Okay, so the other perpetuating factor I'm going to talk about in detail is the way that PTSD is perpetuated by changes in our belief system. So by definition, traumas are things that shake us and challenge our previously held beliefs about ourselves, about the world, and about other people. Interpersonal index traumas are most potent because our beliefs about other people and how much we can trust them and ourselves are really important to our sense of security and well-being. So if you believe that the world is a safe place and then you experience an accident, a natural disaster, being mugged or assaulted, that experience naturally goes against your belief that the world is a safe place because it's an example of how the world is not safe. If you have a belief that people are good, interpersonal assaultative traumas naturally change that belief because a person is doing something bad to you. If you believe that you're in control, that you can manage and mitigate risk in your life and basically prevent bad things from happening to you, and then something uncontrollable happens, like a natural disaster or a terrorist attack, that shakes your belief in control. And if you feel safe in your body and believe that you can trust it and control what happens to it, and then you experience a sudden illness or a medical emergency, that really shakes that belief too. And actually being in the intensive care unit is one of the most traumatic medical experiences, and it's a major cause of PTSD, even though it's not an interpersonal trauma. So because traumatic experiences challenge our positive beliefs about the world, the beliefs that make us feel safe and in control, having traumatic experiences can lead to those beliefs changing and developing into maladaptive beliefs that the world is dangerous or that we're not in control at all. So an example of this comes from the author Alice Sebold, who wrote about her rape and sexual assault in her memoir, Lucky. And she wrote, "When I was raped, I lost my virginity and almost lost my life." So index trauma, a threat to physical integrity and life. "I also discarded certain assumptions I had held about how the world worked and how safe I was." So not only was the trauma life-threatening in the immediate experience of it, but it also threatened how she saw the world and how she saw herself in it. And those two threats together are what make traumas so potent. So the examples on the first slide, beliefs about how the world works and beliefs about self and others, are typically examples of core beliefs or schemas. These are our basic underlying beliefs about the world, ourselves, and others. Many people have mostly positive schemas, like at your core, you might believe that you're basically a good person, that other people can basically be trusted, that the world is relatively predictable, and that you have control over what happens to you. These types of positive schemas and also negative schemas are all learned from experience and direct teaching. And for the most part, our core beliefs about the world, our schemas, have their origins in our childhood, when we're very plastic and malleable and we're basically experiencing everything for the first time and learning what to think about it. These beliefs can be activated, just like trauma memories, by life events that trigger thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So this cycle should be pretty familiar. This is basically an example of the interrelationship of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Bodily sensations in lectures 3 and 4, I kind of lumped in with emotions because they're basically the same thing. But the interplay of thoughts, behaviors, and feelings can be activated by the activation of our core beliefs. When a life event happens that activates one of our core beliefs, we either take it as evidence that our core belief is true, or it becomes evidence that weighs against our core belief. And we have to figure out what to do about that conflict. In many cases of psychopathology other than PTSD, the cognitive distortions, so the negative attributions, the maladaptive thoughts, the jumping to conclusions, the overgeneralizing, the catastrophic thinking, these distortions can be activated by life events, but indirectly by those life events actually activating our core beliefs. And when we talked about predisposing factors to PTSD that are shared with predisposing factors to anxiety and depression, one of those is the types of schemas that someone has. Having the core belief that the world is dangerous or having the core belief that you're not in control predisposes you to develop anxiety and depression and to developing PTSD after a trauma. So here's an example of how schemas interact with maladaptive automatic thoughts. This is an example of an attribution or a thought about an event in the context of panic disorder. When people with panic disorder experience physiological sensations that they associate with panic attacks, they make catastrophic assumptions about what those events mean. So someone might experience shortness of breath and have the thought, I'm going crazy, which then leads to increasing sympathetic arousal and fear and makes someone more likely to try to escape the situation that's making them feel so terrible. However, for some people, that shortness of breath actually activates a core belief, the feeling that I'm not in control of what happens to me, I'm not in control of my body, I'm not in control. And it's actually that activation of the core belief that you're not in control that activates the thought, I'm going crazy, and then the emotions and feelings and behaviors that come with that thought. An example in depression, so we talked about negative attribution styles in response to negative life events. This example of someone's girlfriend being annoyed because you didn't do the dishes, making internal, stable, and global attributions about the cause of that negative life event. And then the emotional and behavioral response that comes from those attributions. For some people, though, that negative life event actually activates a core belief. It's not just that your girlfriend is annoyed with you, but her annoyance, that interpersonal stress, triggers and activates your deep-seated underlying belief that you're not lovable, that there's something wrong with you, that people will reject you and leave you. And it's that core belief activation that actually causes you to make these internal, stable, and global attributions that in turn result in maladaptive emotions and behavior. So just getting back to other disorders for 1 second, not everyone with something like panic disorder or depression has negative schemas from childhood. Not everyone with these disorders has these core negative beliefs about themselves, other people, and the world. In some cases, the automatic thoughts that perpetuate anxiety and depression can be generated by cognitive distortions that arose in response to more recent life events. And when automatic thoughts and cognitive distortions aren't activated by negative schemas, it actually makes cognitive behavioral therapy go much faster and response to treatment more rapid. Okay, so getting back to trauma. When you have a traumatic experience that really challenges a core belief about the world, we have to process that disconnect somehow. And the two ways that we integrate experiences into our existing belief system, whether or not those experiences are traumatic, are called accommodation and assimilation. Accommodation refers to the process of changing or altering your pre-existing schemas in order to account for the thing that happened to you. If something that happened to you really challenges and is incompatible with your core beliefs, one way of dealing with that is modifying your core beliefs to help explain what happened. The other way of dealing with that is basically forcing what happened to you into your existing belief system, often by changing how you remember or how you respond to the thing that happened. So both accommodation and assimilation are normal parts of life. They're normal ways of processing experiences, both traumatic and non-traumatic. And to some degree, accommodating beliefs to incorporate the trauma and assimilating the trauma into your pre-existing belief system is part of a normal response to trauma. But when people basically take these normal responses too far and over-accommodate or over-assimilate, This can lead to negative changes in the belief system that perpetuates PTSD. So, for example, if someone over-accommodates a challenge to their pre-existing belief system, this could look like basically changing all of their beliefs in response to a trauma that maybe didn't challenge all of their beliefs, that maybe should have only caused very focal and specific changes to their belief system. So for example, someone who thought that the world was safe, but then experienced a terrorist attack might over-accommodate that challenge to their belief system by coming to the opposite conclusion. The world is totally dangerous, I'm always in danger. Someone who had a core belief that they were a good person, but then did something that went against that, like taking someone's life in military combat, might over-accommodate by, again, totally changing how they feel about themselves and coming to believe that they're a bad person who doesn't deserve to be loved. Examples of over-assimilation might look like someone who has the core belief that people are trustworthy, but who experiences interpersonal violence has to come up with some explanation of what happened to them that doesn't change their belief that people are trustworthy. So they might think, well, I must have done something to provoke it. It must be my fault somehow. Maybe that means that other people are trustworthy, but I am a bad person and I deserve to be hurt. Someone who thinks that they're in control of their risk, but then experiences an uncontrollable risk like a natural disaster, might try to assimilate that natural disaster into their belief that they are really in control by deciding that it only happened because they weren't prepared enough. They blame themselves for what happened and they start to feel that they are incompetent and helpless. Someone who used to trust their body and feel safe in their body, but then experienced a medical emergency, might try to assimilate that trauma into their pre-existing worldview of being safe in their body by trying to convince themselves that the experience wasn't really that bad, by basically gaslighting themselves and telling themselves that they overreacted, they're too sensitive. So as you can imagine, all of these changes in core beliefs are really too extreme. These examples result in someone going from a relatively positive core belief to a very negative one in response to a single trauma. And really, accommodation and assimilation shouldn't be this complete. It should be possible to make smaller changes in your belief system. Like, I thought that the world was totally safe and then something bad happened to me. I now believe that the world is generally safe, but bad things can still happen. I thought I felt safe in my own body, but then I experienced a catastrophic illness. That was horrible and terrifying, and I guess I'm not always safe in my own body, but I know that I can cope with anything that happens because I got through it. Those are examples of appropriate accommodation and assimilation that are less likely to lead to the development of PTSD. So, PTSD arousal symptoms can largely be explained by these two perpetuating factors. So remember, PTSD arousal symptoms basically involve constant hypervigilance, really easily triggered sympathetic nervous system activation, constant feelings of tension and hyperarousal. So this can be caused by problems with memory encoding because each time a trauma memory is retrieved, the limbic system is activated. This leads to lots of basically false alarms where you experience strong limbic activation in the absence of a real danger. Just like with panic disorder and specific phobias, these false alarm activations can cause the development of conditioned fears to formerly neutral and objectively safe stimuli in your environment that were present during that activation. So chronic limbic activation, because of poorly encoded memories, can lead to the development of multiple new fear conditioned stimuli that basically in a vicious cycle lead to higher likelihood of fear responses in the future and constant hyperarousal. Similarly, belief changes. When a trauma-informed belief, like the world is completely dangerous, I'm completely incompetent, become your lens for seeing the world, it leads you to interpret even safe events through a lens of trauma, which leads to constant anxiety. If I think that I'm totally incompetent and don't make good decisions, every decision that I make becomes anxiety-provoking and fearful because I'm blaming myself for the trauma that I experienced. So similarly, this leads to constant increased anxiety and the same process, constant false alarm fear responses, new fear learning generalizing to new conditioned stimuli, leading to hyperarousal. The same can be said for negative alterations in mood too. If you're constantly afraid, that can sensitize your HPA axis. It can lead to HPA axis over-arousal, constant stress, negative affect. Changes in belief systems also lead to negative maladaptive interpretations of interpersonal events that can lead to feelings of sadness, guilt, depression, anhedonia. So basically, the etiological process of PTSD is a process of interrupted recovery from trauma. Shortly after a traumatic experience, all symptoms of PTSD are pretty normal and expected. It's normal after something really bad happens to you to be kind of hyper-aroused and hyper-vigilant for a while, paying attention to potential signs of danger in the environment to make sure that what just happened to you isn't repeated, that it's not part of a new pattern that you need to learn. It's pretty normal for previously safe experiences to feel dangerous. In the immediate aftermath of a trauma, it's kind of normal to overgeneralize, maybe over accommodate your beliefs about the world and yourself. And in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, because the memory was encoded during intense arousal or dissociation, it's normal for trauma memories to be fragmented, poorly organized, and connected to the limbic system. During the recovery process from trauma, people gradually resume their normal activities. They go back into those formerly safe environments that were scary right after the trauma. And this gives them the opportunity to experience safety learning. They can relearn that those situations are safe. This process helps people realize that the traumatic event was actually relatively rare and not really representative of what's going to happen to them for the rest of their life, which can help them modify their over-assimilated and over-accommodated beliefs and make the changes in their belief system or their memory of the trauma a little bit more reasonable and proportional. And then repeatedly recalling the trauma memory because you're going about your daily activities and it's being activated, or because you're not avoiding thinking and talking about it and you're intentionally activating it, helps to encode it properly. In PTSD, when people start to avoid normal activities, they lose the opportunity for safety learning, and they lose the opportunity for re-encoding and consolidating memories on their own terms, when they're feeling safe, when they're feeling in control, when they chose to do it, rather than when those memories are involuntarily activated. Because they're continuing to avoid their normal lives, their beliefs about themselves or the world continue to be shaped and informed by the trauma, and that becomes the new lens through which they experience and interpret all subsequent events. So this leads to the development of strong maladaptive cognitive distortions and even the development of new core beliefs and schemas. And alterations in both memory, encoding and retrieval, and beliefs about the world lead to the mood and arousal symptoms of PTSD. So takeaways: alterations in memory encoding are both a precipitating factor because they happen during a trauma, and they're an early perpetuating factor. They perpetuate the effect of the sympathetic arousal and fear that happened during the trauma by causing that memory to be constantly reactivated through poor consolidation. Changes in the belief system are a later perpetuating factor. These are both behavioral and cognitive changes that help to maintain symptoms by preventing new safety learning. People naturally in the aftermath of the trauma may overgeneralize the trauma, but when they avoid resuming their activities and getting back into the world, that overgeneralization persists. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a couple slides on treating PTSD, and all of this information is also in the videos that I'm having you guys watch for homework, so you can really think of this as just an optional review. So both of the cognitive behavioral interventions for PTSD that we're talking about in this class act on perpetuating factors to try to modify them, and by modifying these perpetuating factors, modify the other symptoms. So in prolonged exposure therapy, the process of this therapy involves repeatedly activating the trauma memory through really intense, vivid imaginal exposure, where the memory is held in active working memory. During this time, when the memory is activated and unstable and subject to reconsolidation, the patient is encouraged to recall as many vivid, visceral, specific details of that memory as possible. By doing this, by adding in details, by getting the timeline straight, by providing context and fitting the memory into your life story, this actually alters the way that the memory is stored, and it moves it away from this visceral, immediate, interconnected with the limbic system node into a more normal memory load, one that's more autobiographical, contextualized, verbal, and less likely to activate the limbic system when it's retrieved. Prolonged exposure therapy involves both imaginal exposure, where you remember the trauma, and in vivo exposure, where you expose yourself to environmental cues that trigger the trauma memory. And through this exposure, you are also forming new memories, also known as safety learning. You're learning that you can retrieve the memories of the trauma, that you can put yourself back in the place where you had the trauma, but still be safe. You're relearning what is safe to do, and you're basically getting back activities and thoughts that the trauma took away from you. So the primary goal of prolonged exposure therapy, the thing that makes it unique, is the goal is to reconsolidate trauma memory through repeated retrieval, both through imaginal exposure and in vivo exposure. Whereas prolonged exposure therapy really works on alterations in memory, encoding and retrieval, cognitive processing therapy more targets changes in beliefs. So just like other types of cognitive therapy, there's a heavy dose of cognitive restructuring, where the patient and therapist together explore the ways that trauma might have changed and challenged their beliefs about the world. They work on recognizing distortions, so ways that they over-accommodated or over-assimilated, and then work through exposure to unlearn those memories, to unlearn those belief changes, to prove those changes in belief wrong. So again, exposure works through pairing a feared conditioned stimulus with information about safety, leading to habituation and safety learning. And cognitive processing therapy also involves behavioral experiments where people deliberately create situations where they can test the validity of their over-accommodated and over-assimilated beliefs. So for example, if you're someone who thought that people could be trusted, but then were assaulted and now think that everyone is unsafe, you can systematically set up challenges to that belief by putting yourself in increasingly more and more vulnerable positions. The first challenge to that belief that everyone is dangerous might be just going to therapy and opening up to a therapist who is another person. That creates an opportunity to challenge your belief that absolutely nobody can be trusted and no one has your best interests at heart. Once you've completed that behavioral experiment, you might extend it to new situations. So resuming activities with friends, going up to strangers in coffee shops and talking to them, putting yourself in situations like going out to bars at night or getting drunk, making yourself increasingly more vulnerable in normal, safe ways to prove your over-accommodated beliefs wrong. So the goal of cognitive processing therapy is to integrate the trauma, what happened to you, into a more balanced belief system about yourself, the world, and other people. And I forgot to say this. In the predisposing factors portion of this lecture, I mentioned that rigid belief systems are predisposing factors. And these can be both rigidly negative belief systems, like the schema that the world is dangerous and I'm not in control, which is a predisposing factor to anxiety and depression. But also it can be overly rigid positive beliefs about the world. If you truly believe that every danger can be prevented and every person can be trusted, that's actually not super accurate either in the other direction. And that belief system, while it may seem more positive, is not necessarily adaptive because it's going to be really easy for life events to challenge those beliefs. So, of course, the common factors between these two therapies for PTSD are that they both work to reduce avoidance of safe situations, of thinking about the trauma, of exposing yourself to things that trigger the memory. They both work to challenge cognitive distortions and unhelpful beliefs. Prolonged exposure therapy does this sort of indirectly by creating safety learning, whereas cognitive processing therapy really targets the beliefs explicitly. The goal of both is to integrate the trauma memory into your autobiographical memory store and basically fit it into your narrative life story and your understanding of the world and yourself. And they both work to assimilate trauma into your existing schemas and modify schemas that might be overly rigid to help incorporate the trauma without overdoing it and using the trauma to explain absolutely everything. So, takeaways. Trauma causes psychological injury for everyone by definition. Most people who experience a trauma, and remember that 70% of us at least will experience an index trauma in our lifetime, will heal naturally. Having some PTSD symptoms right after a trauma is part of normal recovery, and it's not disordered. PTSD itself is caused by interruptions in the healing process through a lack of trauma memory consolidation, over-assimilation and over-accommodation, and behavioral avoidance, all of which can cause alterations in arousal and mood. All right, that is that. Sorry, that was a little bit longer than others.